cocktails laced with sleeping pills, bunkers and chains, drugs, slavery. All this resembles the plots of films. But similar stories happen in real life. These girls were captured, but were able to return home. Thousands of people are abducted in the world every year. Sometimes they are children. Some of them manage to escape and return to their family after a few weeks, months, or even years. Here are 5 real stories about those who were imprisoned and went through the hardest trials, but were able to survive. Someone was kidnapped on the way from school. Someone was abducted right out of bed. And someone did not even have to leave their home. One of the heroines spent a quarter of a century in captivity of her own father. Elizabeth Smart, 9 months in captivity. Life in captivity. 5 high-profile abduction stories. American Elizabeth Smart was only 14 years old when she was abducted from her parents. Late at night, an unknown man sneaked into the girl's room, put a knife to her throat, took her outside, and took her to a forest hut. The kidnapper organized the wedding ceremony and made Elizabeth his wife. He starved the girl for several days, beat her, forced her to watch porn, and gave her alcohol. In addition, Elizabeth had to use drugs. The maniac wanted to psychologically suppress the schoolgirl and convince her that he was a prophet. Later it turned out that Elizabeth was taken away by 49-year-old wandering Mormon preacher Brian Mitchell and his wife Wanda Barzee. The prisoner was freed thanks to bystanders and Elizabeth's younger sister, who pretended to be asleep at the time of the abduction. She could remember the voice of the perpetrator. According to the girl, he resembled the voice of a handyman whom the Smart family once hired to repair the roof. The artist painted a portrait of Mitchell, which was then shown on the popular TV program America's Most Wanted. The very next day, the audience called the police and reported that they had seen a similar person. So the investigators were able to arrest the kidnapper, and Elizabeth returned home. For a long time, she refused to talk about what happened in captivity. Gradually, the girl returned to her usual life. She graduated from school, went to university, and even became an activist in the movement for the safety of children. The fate of Brian Mitchell has been decided for several years. He was sentenced to life terms without parole. Katya Mamontova and Lena Samakina, for years, in captivity. Life in captivity. 5 high-profile abduction stories. This story happened in Ryazan. It all started on the evening of October 30, 2000, when 14-year-old Katya and 17-year-old Lena were returning home after a disco. Buses and trolleybuses were no longer running, so the friends were very glad that white Lada car stopped nearby. A friendly elderly man looked out of the car. He promised to get the girls home quickly and inexpensively. Besides the driver, there was a young guy inside who introduced himself as Lisha. He persuaded Katya and Lena to have a little drink in honor of the holiday. They agreed. The friends woke up in a cramped concrete bunker 100 kilometers from Ryazan. The kidnapper built it in the basement of the garage in advance. He conducted electricity, made ventilation, installed a 2-story bed and an electric stove. And to lure the victims into an underground prison, he mixed strong sleeping pills. For almost 4 years, the maniac used his girlfriends as hostages. During this time, Lena had 2 boys. I had to give birth without doctors, in the same basement. To do this, the rapist gave the girls several books on pediatrics and obstetrics. Their tormentor turned out to be 54-year-old Ryazan worker Viktor Makov. For any offense, he severely punished his girlfriends. He turned off the electricity, sprayed tear gas, and blocked the air. Hope for salvation appeared when the man took turns taking them out for a walk. During one of them, Katya secretly passed a note asking for help to a student who rented a room from a maniac. She took her to the police, but Katya and Lena were not found immediately. The basement was perfectly camouflaged. Makov was sentenced to 17 years, a high-security penal colony. Natasha Kampush, 8 years in captivity. Life in captivity. 5 high-profile abduction stories. The story of the abduction of Austrian Natasha Kampush formed the basis of the painting 3096 Days and the autobiography of the same name. That's how long she was in captivity. In the spring of 1998, a 10-year-old girl went to school as usual, but did not make it. No one has seen her since. However, one witness later said that Natasha Kampush was forcibly pushed into a white minibus. The police conducted an operational search and even interrogated the real maniac, but it did not yield results. The perpetrator did not arouse suspicion, and he was released. From that moment on, Natasha's childhood turned into a real nightmare. Her home for 8 long years was a cramped 5-meter room in the basement. The prisoner later called it the mouse hole. The maniac often bullied the girl, beat her, broke bones, shaved her head, raped and tied her to himself. And if he didn't like something, he drowned the girl in a basin, turned off the air conditioner and lights in the basement. On the contrary, for good behavior, the pedophile brought her books, magazines, and games. Over time, a TV, a table and a blackboard appeared in the basement. Later, Natasha learned the name of the kidnapper. It was 39-year-old Wolfgang Pricklepeel. Gradually, he began to allow the captive to walk around the house and garden, and one day took her to a ski resort. Natasha was released on August 23, 2006, when the perpetrator asked her to vacuum his car. The man was distracted by a phone call, and Natasha ran away to the neighbors. To avoid punishment, Pricklepeel committed suicide. The news of his death upset the girl, and a few years later she bought his house. Fusako Sano, 9 years, in captivity. Life in captivity. 5 high-profile abduction stories. The schoolgirl was abducted at the age of 9 when she was returning home from a baseball game. A car pulled up nearby, and a young man got out. Threatening with a knife, he forced the girl to climb into the trunk, and then disappeared in an unknown direction. The police were unable to find any leads. Someone assumed that Fusako Sano was kidnapped by a North Korean prostitute. Her photos were pasted up in Niigata Prefecture for a long time, but the hope of finding the schoolgirl alive was fading. The girl spent more than 9 years with the maniac. All this time, she was about 50 kilometers from her home, and most importantly, 500 meters from the police station. Mentally unstable unemployed Japanese Nobuyuki Sato brought her to his room and chained her to the bed. The kidnapper occasionally fed the girl ready-made food and beat her regularly. In addition, he bought a taser to educate the captive. Due to the sedentary lifestyle, Fusako's limbs gradually began to atrophy. She was weak, so she didn't even try to escape. The kidnapper's elderly mother lived in the same house, but she could not go up to the second floor because of leg problems and did not know about the girl. Her son's mental state was deteriorating. He became more aggressive. Then the woman called the social service. The staff who arrived to inspect Nobuyuki found a pale, emaciated, stuttering girl in his room. Fusako has never been able to adjust to a normal life. Today she hardly communicates with anyone and often walks alone. Her abductor was sentenced to 14 years in prison. Elizabeth Fritzl, 24 years, in captivity. Life in captivity. 5 high-profile abduction stories and even more monstrous story became known. In the spring of 2008, Austrian electrician Joseph Fritzl did not kidnap other people's children. Instead, he set up a soundproof bunker in the basement of his house and locked his youngest daughter Elizabeth there. Immediately after that, the man reported her missing, and later handed over to investigators a letter in which the girl reported that she was leaving to live separately. Elizabeth wrote it under duress. However, this version was believed not only by the police, but also by the girl's relatives. From that moment on, the search stopped. Elizabeth tried to shout to her family, but they didn't hear her. Joseph Fritzl went down to the bunker only to give his daughter food and rape her. And if she resisted, he chained her up and threatened to spray gas. During her imprisonment, the girl had 7 children. Moreover, Fritzl threw 3 of them at the threshold of his house. He put small letters in diapers where the runaway daughter reported that she could not raise a child because of difficulties with money. 1 baby died immediately, and 3 more were raised underground. Elizabeth's torment lasted for almost a quarter of a century. Her eldest daughter Kirsten helped her to be free. The girl became seriously ill, so 42-year-old Elizabeth was able to persuade her father to take her to the hospital. The doctors were amazed by the patient's condition and immediately called the police. In the end, Fritzl had to take Elizabeth to the doctors. He warned his daughter not to tell anyone anything. Despite this, when the police isolated Elizabeth from her father, she talked about life in prison. Fritzl was given a life sentence,